Hello, welcome to the first episode of Heard on the Grape Vine, a new drinks podcast from Amateur Wine. You can find out more about the Amateur Wine blog and the podcast at amateurwine.co.uk. For this first episode, I was joined by Colin Hampden White, the launch editor of the new Whisky quarterly magazine. Join us now as we talk and taste whisky. Hi Colin, you're a photographer, journalist, and now the editor of the new Whisky quarterly magazine. Tell me, how did you go from being a photographer to an editor?
I'm predominantly a photographer, I suppose, and although I think that's how people see me. Although I've been writing about wine and whisky for about 5 to 6 years. I'm starting off with Lux magazine, owned by Duras Salai, the editor-in-chief of Condé Nast, and then started writing about wine and whisky in other magazines and taking photographs along the way, and that just led itself to this magazine, Whisky Quarterly. The first issue is a moderate template for what we want to come in the future. We don't know exactly what people are going to like, so we wanted to produce something that we thought most people would like at this point. We wanted a section on traditional old world whiskies, which we called Homeland, which covers Scotland and Ireland. Then we've got a section on world whiskies, which covers everything from the rest of the world. And in this issue we've written about whiskies from Switzerland, Australia. So it's called Global Views is the section. Yeah. We've got the States, Swiss, Japanese.
Gosh, kosher whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds interesting.
There's a big call for kosher whiskey.
So it must be made by a Jewish man, if it's the same as for wine?
It can be blessed, I think they call it.
Okay.
Once they understand and they realise that the processes that are used are kosher, a rabbi can come up and approve the whiskey or bless the whiskey and so on at the distillery, I think, as it goes into or whilst it's in barrel. And I don't know the details. I mean, for example, I think that it depends on the percentage of unkosher product.
Okay.
So I think, for example, it's difficult for sherried whiskies to be kosher.
Okay.
Because sherry in itself is not a kosher product.
Because of the biological agent, I guess.
Exactly. Whilst with bourbon, it's not a problem. And I know that Glenrothes produce a kosher whiskey. There's a little sign on the back of the bottle. And we're writing about cocktails. And we're going to have some market reports. And the rest of it's just nice interviews with key people in the industry. And we've started off by interviewing, or rather introducing, I suppose, some of our major contributors to the readership.
Yeah.
Not all of the readership are whisky aficionados and know everybody who writes about whisky. So we've done an interview with Charlie McLean, who is going to be writing for us. And we've done another interview with Cask Strength. That's Neil and Joel Ridley. Who are our deputy editors, exactly. So we did an interview with them, sort of explaining their background and where they came from, because they came from the music industry. And this is going to expand, and we'll have other little bits and pieces in there. The section that's called Golden Nuggets will expand and become bigger, and that is where I think we'll have our food and whiskey tastings. It's also, I think, where we will have some opinion pieces.
What sort of opinion?
Well, we're going to have a section that is going to be an article written by somebody who traditionally writes online. And we find that people who traditionally write online, as magazine writers online or bloggers specifically, have this great opportunity to just write what the hell they like. You know, it is all about their opinion, which is fabulous. And there are a few bloggers out there who write about their opinions, but with fabulously backed up arguments and well written English. And we feel that these opinions shouldn't just go online. We'd love to put them into print. So we've got a different online writer writing in each issue, giving us their opinion on something.
So it could be some testy topics, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want it to be a rant. But I think that it'll certainly be interesting.
What do you see as the future of the mag?
The future of the mag, hopefully, will stay pretty much grounded where we've started off. We decided that we wanted to produce 1,000 copies for the UK market, and we had the future idea of perhaps going into other countries later on and having the same business model, just 1,000 copies in each country. So if we went to Hong Kong or if we went to the States, we would have the same business model. But we've realised that with the subscriptions that we've gained, that our readership is already all over the world. So it seems pointless to launch a magazine in the States when there are already people subscribing to Whisky Quarterly in the States. And the same with Hong Kong. And the same with Switzerland and Belgium and Austria and Australia. We've got people literally all over the world. So we thought, okay, let's just keep it very simple. We are only going to have 1,000 copies worldwide.
Is this forever? Because 1,000 obviously is not very much at all.
It's not, but then it's double the amount that Lux magazine has.
Okay.
It's a specialist publication. Therefore, we feel that it doesn't need to have too many copies. And the target readership is also relatively specialist. We don't want people to be just whisky connoisseurs or whisky lovers or amateurs. It doesn't really matter. As long as they like whisky, that's fine. But what we would like is that people who are reading the magazine fit in, firstly, very well with our advertising, which isn't going to include any whisky. It'll be luxury product advertising.
Yeah.
And also the products that we're writing about. Okay. So that if we're writing about a product that is £30, okay, most people can afford that. But then if we're writing about a product that's £3,000, not many people can afford that. And we'd like our readership to be able to pick up the magazine and be able to afford anything that we're writing about.
Okay, so it's not just going to be limited to, £50,000 bottle of something which is only released, once every lifetime, basically.
No, I mean, it is, as we say, it's a magazine for people who like the finer things in life.
Yeah.
That's not describing expense. It's describing things that are fine. And I believe absolutely that there are bottles out there that are £30, or even less than that, that are very good bottles of whisky, that are worth writing about. And there are bottles that are 30 grand that are very good bottles of whisky and worth writing about. And yes, we want to be able to write about all of those things. And the idea with not having any whisky advertising is that we can write about purely the things that we think are good. We aren't pressurised or won't be pressurised at all to write about a product that we're not 100% behind.
With a lot of drinks magazines, they kind of incorporate things like food and travel. Will Whisky Quarterly be just about whisky, or will it be more kind of lifestyle things as well?
There will definitely be some lifestyle things in there as well. We think that food is a very important thing that goes with alcohol, not just wine, but whisky, sake, anything that has alcohol in it, I think can be matched with food. Personally, I wouldn't advocate having a complete whisky dinner with whisky with every course. I think personally that's a bit much. I quite like wine. But there are whiskies that do go very well with certain foods, and we'd certainly like to write about that. We also think there are other products that go well with whisky. Sitting in a school chair is never going to be an enjoyable experience drinking a dram. When you can sit in a nice, big, comfy leather armchair, for example.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're slightly short of leather armchairs today.
That's perfectly comfortable here. But, so we might write about that as an experience. So we could write about furniture, which seems a bizarre thing to write about in terms of whisky, but when you're thinking about the entire experience that you can have with whisky, then it seems perfectly right.
How do you get hold of the magazine?
I go online.
And it's whiskyquarterly.co.uk?
And .com.
Or roots lead to whisky.
I hope so.
So what do you think is the best time of the day, or maybe of the year, to drink whisky? If there is such a thing.
Yeah, whenever you look at your watch. I don't know, I think that the old ideas of having a whisky after dinner, only after dinner, are slightly passé. It's still a very good time to have a whisky as a digestif, but more people are drinking it as an aperitif for dinner. People are drinking it in cocktails. So going out on a Friday or Saturday night. There are whiskies that are very light and floral that one can mix with ice and lots of water on a really hot summer's day at lunchtime instead of having a Chardonnay, for example.
And do you have a preference of how you would drink a whisky, for example, with ice, or are you absolutely nothing, no moderation?
Oh, gosh, no, there are so many ways you can drink whisky. There are great whiskies that go with coconut water, for example.
Really?
Yeah, Dewar's 12-year-olds. Brilliant with coconut water. I was introduced to that actually by Dave Broom. What else? There's fantastic whiskies like Lagavulin 16-year-old, which are perfect by themselves. I don't particularly like them with ice, but they're amazing. It's amazing with Coke. You put 30% Lagavulin, 70% Coke, full fat Coke, and it's awesome. And you wouldn't expect that, but it is just a really good drink. So I think that whiskey can be enjoyed in all sorts of ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be drunk in a nosing glass with no water or little drops of water. It can be drunk in so many different ways. I mean, ultimately, the drink is yours. You drink it how you like it.
And what about the glassware? I mean, we've got these handy kind of double-set glasses, which are very standard for tasting, but do you think glassware matters?
I think glassware can matter, yes. I think as a general tasting glass, the ISO glass is very good. You can taste all different types of wine in it. It'll handle most whiskies. I find that you get a tiny bit more alcohol from an ISO glass on the nose.
Yeah, it's more concentrated.
Yeah. Whilst if you have the Glencairn glass shape, which is a bit like a bulb at the bottom moving up to a tulip. I don't quite know how to describe it.
So more kind of a cognac glass, I guess, a wider...
No, it kind of goes out at the top. It sort of bulbs out at the bottom, comes in to a waist, and then slightly opens out like a tulip at the top.
Okay, so with a bit of a lip.
Yeah, exactly. Tiny bit of a lip. And I find that this allows the alcoholic fumes to come off slightly, but the glass still retains all the flavour. And I think they are probably the perfect glass for nosing and tasting whiskey. But then we're not, always trying to be analytical about whiskey. You can take a perfectly good blend and drink it in a tumbler, and it can still be enjoyable. The only thing I would say, actually, is if you're having it with ice, rather than pouring the whiskey over the ice, which makes all the whiskey very cold very quickly and shuts all the flavours down, pour the whiskey in first and put the ice in afterwards.
That's quite interesting, because, I mean, now lots of people are saying, well, if you have a really big ice cube, then you wouldn't have to worry about that. But would you still then put the whiskey first?
I'd still put the whiskey in first and the ice cube in, the big ice cube, I've got it at home actually, they're great, in second.
Okay.
So that you're not pouring the whiskey over the ice that shocks the whiskey in a way. You're just allowing the ice to then slowly cool the whiskey down. But that's a personal preference. I mean, if you like your whiskey very cold, chuck it over the ice.
Of course. Speaking of whiskey, let's taste some. We've got a selection of Cardus, but we'll start with Cardew Gold Reserve.
Okay.
Which is the most recent release, 11 o'clock in the morning.
Actually, I find 11 o'clock in the morning is the best time for tasting. I do all my competition judging at 11 o'clock in the morning if I can. Because I find that if I'm tasting whiskey, having an appetite helps. So if you're slightly hungry, I haven't had lunch yet, obviously, it's only 11 o'clock.
But
breakfast was some time away. So I find that my appetite is slightly raised, and therefore my senses are slightly raised for tasting.
But does that make all whiskies taste better? Because you're already thinking about the food.
No, not at all. It means that whiskies that aren't very good can also express worse characteristics. Or something is sulphurous, then that sulphur quality will come out even further. It's just your senses are slightly heightened when you're hungry.
Okay, well, the Gold Reserve was released late last year, made in toasted oak casks. No age indication, and it's £35. Let me know what you think.
Is it a mixture of bourbon and sherry casks, did they say? Or
no, they didn't, actually. I think it's just oak cask.
Everything's oak.
Without bourbon, yeah. So it's just toasted oak.
Oh, virgin oak, so nothing in it before.
No.
It hasn't had anything in it before.
No.
Okay.
Because the next one that we're going to taste is the Amber Rock, which they do say that is ex-bourbon.
Ex-bourbon, right.
So I guess that's the kind of difference between the two releases.
I see. It's quite nice and fresh.
Yeah. I mean, it's
not too sweet.
Fruity for me.
Yeah, it's nice. There are a fair amount of esters in it.
What difference does it make in terms of the time of the year that a whiskey is released?
I don't think it really matters. I think that whiskey... Well, commercially, obviously, it does matter. But in terms of, is it good for the whiskey or not, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
You can sit whiskies in vats for ages before release. They don't necessarily have to sit in barrel. You can empty all the barrels out into vats and then bottle it when you want. So I don't think that the time of year really affects the whiskey. It's nice. There's quite a lot of citrus.
Yeah, it is.
In it, which is nice. It's obviously quite young whisky. It's not overly oaky at all.
Do you think the fashion is now to release whiskies younger and younger?
I don't know. I think that some of the distilleries are lacking a particular amount of stock, so they are producing non-age statement whiskies because they don't have a huge amount of old stock, and they are now aging it at the moment.
Okay.
So they're using their younger stocks to be able to fulfill the market. There are also new distilleries, or newer distilleries, that only have whisky that is 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. I know St George's in England, for example, in Norfolk, not a particularly old distillery. They've been producing whisky now for a number of years, but they started producing whisky at 3 years, straight onto the market, and it was perfectly good whisky.
Do you think, for consumers, do they prefer younger whisky, or do they prefer an older whisky?
I don't like so much talking about age, and prefer talking about flavours and maturity.
Yeah.
Some whisky is perfectly good and mature at 3 or 4 years old. I've had some amazing whisky from Overeem in Tasmania that's very young, and it's incredibly good. Whilst, obviously, there are some fantastic old whiskies, we know this. But I think it's much more about choosing when a whisky is ready, when it's mature, and then bottling it at that point, rather than purely thinking about the age. Although I do think age statements will come back from the major distilleries once they've got their stocks back in order. I don't think Macallan are going to do their non-age statements forever. I think that'll change. I think the 18-year-old Macallan will come back at some point.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, so do I.
Well, let's try this.
Nicely balanced. Quite smooth. 40%? Or is it?
Yeah, it's 40%.
It is. Yeah, that's nice. Slightly sweet. A little bit of caramel.
I'm getting a little bit of wood kind of on the finish.
The wood is coming through on the palate. I think it was more integrated on the palate, and on the finish, it is slightly oaky.
Yeah. Would you like to taste the next one?
Yeah.
So the next whisky is the Cardew Amberrock, which was released early in the year, last year as well, 2014, and it's £41, and as I mentioned earlier, it's ex-bourbon, but also toasted barrels. What do you think?
You can smell the vanilla on it straight away, I think. Similar characteristics to the last whisky. Still quite fruity.
I'm getting kind of a really different nose from this one. I kind of feel like this whisky is more masculine to the more feminine of the last one, of the Gold Reserve.
Yeah, there's more depth to it. I can pick up the oak on the nose on this. I'm not saying it's bad oak, I think it smells quite integrated, but I couldn't on the last one. So.
Do you think of whisky as masculine and feminine?
I think that when I'm tasting whisky, it changes so much depending on if I'm eating with it, my mood, the weather. So that sometimes a whisky that I would consider to be quite feminine, light, floral, with honey notes, for example, if I'm drinking that on a bitterly cold shoot in the north of Scotland, then it becomes quite intense, and you feel the alcohol, and it's much less feminine under those circumstances.
Yes.
So I suppose it depends on the circumstance, but overall, yes. I mean, I would say that, yes, you could describe some whiskies as predominantly being more feminine than others. Big sherry bombs from Speyside could hardly be described as feminine.
Well, let's try this. I feel like
the vanilla's very upfront.
Yeah, but I kind of feel like it's more rounded compared to the last one. But maybe because the last one was the first whiskey of the day.
That's a strong possibility. It is very well balanced. I think the oak is better integrated in this because of the vanilla flavours. The two are more harmonious together, whilst the other one, without having any alcohol in it beforehand, the oak comes through quite strongly in comparison to this. It's still very nice. It's got nice zesty citrus notes in it, and some little bits of dried fruit as well. Tiny bits of, not sweet dried fruit. I know, slightly odd descriptor, but if you had sort of dried apricots without the sweetness.
I mean, for a novice, for somebody who's kind of just coming to whiskey, how would you say how to approach tasting a whiskey?
Well, I believe that about 90% of tasting whiskey is smelling it. So I would smell a whiskey, not necessarily sticking your nose right into it, big sniff, because otherwise the alcohol will desensitise your nose. But just smell it lightly, and you shouldn't need to smell it more than once or twice. You smell more than that and you're not picking much up. Smell it once or twice, and if you like it, and you like that smell, you're likely to like the flavour. If you don't like the smell, then I'd move on, try something else.
That could be a very expensive evening of moving on, potentially.
Potentially, yeah.
Gosh.
But I think the best way to find out what you do and don't like is just practice.
What's your favourite whiskey?
That does very much depend on my mood and where I'm at and what I'm doing. I haven't come across a whiskey yet that I have not thought that I would find a circumstance in which I would like it. I mean, there are some whiskies that are not great because of the way they've been stored and the casks they've been kept in and so on. And those whiskies are one-offs. They're usually single cask whiskies.
Okay.
And you're going to get the odd single cask whiskey which just isn't very good. And I tend to not include them. You know, you can't rate Lagavulin on one bad cask that somebody bought 10 years ago. But I've tasted whiskey pretty much from every distillery, and I haven't come across a whiskey yet, or a distillery yet, that I haven't liked.
You were a Scotsman as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you've had your fair share of whiskey, I guess, growing up, even.
Yes. I have, yeah. My father liked whiskey, so I did try quite a lot of whiskey in my teens, in moderation, in the same way that we were taught how to drink wine when we were teenagers.
Yeah.
You'd have a glass of wine with a meal. And if we didn't have wine with a meal, my father might give me a glass of whiskey, always mixed with water. Simply because I was a teenager, and there's no point giving a teenager hard spirit. Cut 50-50 with water, so that I could just experience the flavours. And it was back then that I started to understand the simple differences between whiskies. Some are smoky, some are peaty, some are sweet, some are caramel, and those basic differences. And I got to understand back then what I liked, and that has evolved and changed through the years.
Well, I mean, what kind of way has it evolved? Have you gone for more peaty ones, or?
I think I now have a much more eclectic taste in whiskies. Back when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, I didn't particularly like peated whiskies. And I think also peated whiskies have evolved since then. There are a lot more peated whiskies out there now that are sweeter and smoother.
So kind of more gentle use of peat.
Absolutely. I mean, I think actually, was it last year, the Oraverdes came out from Ardbeg, which was a much gentler whiskey than most people associate with Ardbeg. And this diversification in distilleries, I think, is a good thing. But no, I do like a good, strong, peated whiskey every now and again, an Octomore or something like that.
Octomore has some interesting releases. There's one, I think, several years ago, which was released, which had been finished in a Sauterne cask.
Yeah.
Which, well, I didn't get a chance to taste it, but it sounds really quite amazing.
It was very interesting, actually. I thought that, I was surprised that you could really notice the effect of the Sauterne cask.
Really?
Because there's so much peat in it. I thought that one would just blow away the other, but it didn't. And it just gave this lovely little sweet, for me, little sort of sweet, fresh apricot edge to the whiskey, which was lovely.
Sounds amazing. Shall we taste the next one?
Yeah, why not?
I think I might cook with this.
Oh, whiskey's great to cook with. It's good if you like doing honey glazes on things.
Yeah.
A bit of whiskey and a honey glaze.
Well, we just had some kind of salmon with honey and soy glaze yesterday, so that would have been perfect, actually. Would you prefer some water with this one? It's 54%.
I'm going to try it without first of all, and then might put a little bit in after that.
Okay.
When I'm doing whiskey judging, I tend to start with it neat, put a few drops in, and then by the time I'm finishing tasting a whiskey, especially if I'm doing detailed notes on a whiskey, it takes about an hour, and I end up with a 30%, 25%, sometimes even 20%, just slowly adding more water, letting it sit, letting it evolve, and you can get so much more out of a whiskey by adding different levels of water into
I
it.
mean, for the consumer, would you recommend that being an interesting way of tasting it, just slowly adding more water?
I think it's probably an interesting thing to do, to try once. I would say that most whiskies are not pleasurable drinks with that much water in them. But then that's not always true. Last summer, actually no, summer before last, I went to a lunch at Berry Brothers, a whisky lunch with Doug McIver. And it was a boiling hot day in July, and we were presented with a big Chardonnay glass with what looked like Chardonnay in it, with some blocks of ice.
Okay.
And we thought, okay, that's a bit odd to do that to a Chardonnay, but anyway, gave it a smell, and still thought that that was probably a Chardonnay. Smelled quite new worldy though. And then took a sip and thought, God no, that's whiskey. And they'd taken a 1988 grain whiskey from Invergordon and just chilled it down, put ice in it and quite a lot of water, so that it was about the strength of a wine, around about somewhere between 13 and 14. I mean, they were doing it by eye, so... But anyway, it was absolutely delicious. It's a fantastic way to drink.
This third whiskey is the Cardew 21-year-old, so it's retailing around £160 and was released in 2013, distilled in 1991, so it's got a bit more age in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only kind of 6,000 bottles of this world. Well, actually, there must be a lot less now. So what do you think?
Considering its alcohol, it's not prickly on the nose at all. It's very rounded. Nice fruit. There's a mixture of fresh and dried fruits in it.
It's got quite a bit higher in alcohol as well, at 54.2%.
I mean, although you do pick that up a little bit on the nose, it's not too much. Some whiskies can be less than that, and when you give them a sniff, the alcohol's far too prevalent. This isn't. This is really nicely balanced. There's nice little winey notes in there.
Yeah.
Bits of sherry influence, I think.
This is ex-bourbon cask as well, yeah, American oak.
Okay. The vanilla in it is quite tempered. It's quite a complex whiskey. The younger whiskey that we had, the Amber Rock, the vanilla was quite prevalent, whilst with this it's really well integrated with the other flavours.
So it's only the second release, I think, of their special releases.
Right.
And the last one, I think, was in 2005.
There's a lot less caramel in it than a traditional Cardew, like the 12-year-old or the 18. I like that a lot. It's one thing I like to do with older whiskies is just hold it over the palate for every second it's been in a barrel. So those flavours can just evolve on the palate. It's quite an intense whiskey.
It really is, yeah.
There's quite a lot of oak on it. But it's nice, sweet oak. It's not a drying oak.
I mean, it's much more obvious kind of on the palate than it is on the nose.
Yeah. But I quite like that. I don't mind that at all. I think that the other flavours are in balance with it. It's not like the oak is standing out like a spike on a graph.
Would you like some water in yours?
Yeah, I'd like a little bit of water. Let's see. This
I'll let you.
hint of floral in it, I suspect. That might come out a little bit more with water.
Where do you think is really exciting for whiskey right now?
Gosh, all over the place. There's some amazing whiskies being produced around the world. Taiwan produces the Kavalan port cask, which I love, really good. Valley in Finland are producing some very nice young whiskey. There's really good whiskies coming out of the States. There was the Balcones single malt from Texas, which was great. It's a shame that Chip Tate's parted company with Balcones. We'll see what happens. And there's no reason why Balcones can't continue to create great whiskies without Tate. On the other hand, also, we hope that Chip is going to go off and create some new great whiskies somewhere else.
Sure.
So it's a win-win situation, really. And I think it's all good competition as well. I think in Scotland they're realising that although world whiskies are only a small percentage of the market, that still chips away at their own market.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, even though kind of Scotch whiskey has had, I think, well, single malts especially, has had a really big revival for the last, well, maybe even decade, you do kind of feel, especially Japanese whiskies, gaining a bigger market share.
Absolutely. I think the Japanese whiskies are getting a greater market share in the UK than they have had before. They are incredibly good whiskies. I think that they're getting some great press, which helps. And I think that their market share is growing because we're seeing more of the product. There were quite a lot of whiskies that we just simply wouldn't see in the UK. And there are some cult status Japanese whiskies that sort of help the PR engine along, whiskies that are distilleries that are closed, Hanyu and Karazawa,
Yeah.
which produced fabulous whiskies. And then there's Yamazaki with the sherry that won Jim Murray's best whisky last year. Another great whisky. I don't know whether it would be my best, but it would certainly be in my top 3. I really loved it. So yeah, they are doing extraordinarily well. I think Scotch is rising to that challenge. As you say, whisky takes a long time to mature.
Yes.
So they're not going to do things quickly as a knee-jerk reaction just because people are suddenly liking big sherry Japanese whiskies. They'll continue what they're doing, I think, in Scotland and just try and do it better. It's good for the consumer. And with new distilleries popping up all over the place, it's exciting.
The publisher of Whisky Quarterly, he's got his own whisky. Is that aged in Poland?
Oh no, he's bought it in Scotland. I mean, it's sitting in bond up in Scotland. So it's all Scottish whisky. I don't think he has any Japanese whisky
Okay.
yet. I think he'd like some. So yes, his whisky is sitting in Scotland, is sitting and maturing in Scotland, in casks. And I think he intends to bottle more of that as time goes on. We bottled some for the launch party.
Yes, I heard.
Which was nice. And I don't even have any left.
Are they intended to be blended whiskies, or are they kind of single malts?
They are single malts at the moment.
Okay.
There was a Glentukas 2002, which we had for the launch party, which was first full bourbon, which was lovely, very intense, very sweet vanilla.
Okay.
And caramels, lots of floral notes.
Quite a lot of wood effect, I guess.
The wood was well integrated because it was not bottled too old. It was bottled as a 12-year-old at 61.2%.
Wow.
Quite powerful stuff.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And before that, I mean, his very first bottling actually was a bottling of 1997 Clynelish.
Okay.
Which was fabulous as a 15-year-old. And they had one other one that he bottled. And these are literally just for his friends, some of his investors, family, doing whisky tastings and generally having fun with. He hasn't bottled anything that he's put on the market yet. We did bottle the 2005 Lecheg peated whisky from Tobermory Distillery. And that was great. It just really brought home the whole idea of you bottle something when it's mature, not because of its age. It wasn't particularly old, it was 9 years old.
Okay.
But it just works extremely well, that age, I think, for that distillery.
Wow, what a great hobby to have.
Yes, he does have a good hobby. I'm just lucky to be involved in it.
But this whiskey, the Cardew 21-year-old, it has a really lengthy finish. I mean, even as you were kind of talking, I was thinking, there's quite a bit of fruit left on the palate.
Mm. What I like about it is it's not all dried fruit. There's some nice fresh fruits in there as well. Even little bits of tropical fruit. Some tiny bits of mango. And I'm sure that if we left it longer and added a bit more water, we'd get more out of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, would you like more water?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not particularly floral at the moment. It's much more a fruity whiskey. Yeah. Much more floral now. Sort of heather flowers. We put a decent chunk of water in it. Hedgerow.
What do you think is the best temperature to drink whiskey?
I think that most whiskies do well at room temperature.
Mm-hmm.
At whatever that room temperature happens to be.
Yeah.
So if you're in a little bothy on the north coast of Scotland and it's -10 outside and it happens to be -2 inside, then that's probably not going to be such a bad.
You probably want a bigger dram of your whiskey.
Yeah. You can warm it up with your hands. On the other hand, if you're sitting in a tropical climate, a whiskey that's at room temperature there is probably going to be okay too. I think in very hot climates, I tend to put my bottle of whiskey in a fridge, but only for about 20 minutes. I lived in Kenya for a few years when I left school.
Okay.
And not all the places that we would go to had air conditioning. If I had a bottle of whiskey with me, which wasn't that infrequent, chuck it in the fridge so that it would cool down from 28 degrees, for example.
Yeah.
Especially if we were on the coast with high humidity, and just bring it down to 20. Just
Does
drop it by 5 to 8 degrees. And that made a difference. So it was chilled,
yeah.
Or it would seem chilled because you're sitting in 28 degrees drinking a whiskey that's 20, but it would still be able to give off quite a lot of flavour because it's still 20 degrees, which is relatively warm.
Yeah.
But that's just me. That's how I like to drink whiskey in a hot climate. And I think you can do that with 1 block of ice. I'll do that sometimes if I'm hot in a hotel, 1 block of ice, and then put the ice in for a bit, just take the ice block out before a whiskey gets cold.
Yeah.
And then drink the whiskey. These are all very personal things. I think that people still obviously can drink the whiskey how they want to drink it.
It's good to kind of get an idea of how other people drink whiskey, because as you say, it's a very personal thing. So I think there are lots of people out there who are happy to experiment with how they drink whiskey.
More and more so these days. It's great.
Gosh, this smells gorgeous now.
It is. It's really starting to become alive. Although it's nice without water, I think if I were to encounter this whiskey again, I'd certainly put water in it. It's not a bad lunchtime whiskey, actually, is it?
No, it's not.
All the honey flavours start coming out with the water.
It's a really nice one to finish on.
Definitely.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great tasting more whiskey. I love it.
And we'll look forward to the next issue. When is that coming out?
Next issue will be out in the middle of April. And there's some exciting stuff coming up.
Well, looking forward to the next issue.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
We hope you have enjoyed this first podcast from Amateur Wine. You can find out more about Heard on the Grapevine and subscribe to future episodes at amateurwine.co.uk.